Well, thank you. And I should have said this before. I wanted to thank Dorothy Woodend from DOXA and for the whole DOXA group for making this screening possible. And the Van City Community Office as well, and the Institute for Humanities, all of whom, as Dorothy mentioned, brought this together. I also want to acknowledge my own group, the Media Democracy Counterculture people, and this is part of, we're collaborating as part of one of our events. So, anybody in the room who knows that last line that Stuart Hall left us with, how is that for a nugget poorly cut off? That was very unfortunate. At any rate, what a beautiful and such an interesting movie. Although I have to say, so fascinating that class and Marx were not resonant in it, which in and of itself is a really class was, Marx much less so, but an interesting point of conversation perhaps that will be taken up later in our discussion. It's a real pleasure to have our three panelists with us this evening to give their reflections on the film. Everybody will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then, as I say, we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. At that point, I'm going to ask for the lights to be brought up so I can actually see you, because at this point, you're all just a kind of dark mass out there. To my immediate left is Dr. Samir Gandesha, and Samir is the director of the Institute of Humanities. He's also an associate professor of modern European thought in the Department of Humanities at SFU. He's published in the New German Critique, Political Theory, and Thesis 11, among other journals and edited collections. He's also the co-editor of Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations, currently working on 2 other books. That's a busy schedule. Daniel Takai on the far left is a freelance writer and editor of the Mainlander. He's also co-host of Mainlander Radio on Co-op Radio. Daniel's also been working on and writing on authoritarian populism, which is a theme that's brought him into connection with Hall. Some of you will know that Hall's analysis of Thatcher had much to do, as the film alludes to, with the rise of authoritarian populism. Daniel's interest is in particular in the relationship of authoritarian populism and migrant populations, particularly climate refugees. And in the middle, Maria Wallstum, editor and writer for The Mainlander. She's a master's student at SFU and is also deeply involved with the Social Housing Alliance and also with the left front, I want to say, but the left front with COPE. And many of you know COPE as the left civic party in Vancouver. So the order for reflections, Samir's going to begin, and then Daniel and Maria are going to speak in conjunction with each other, I think is fair to say. And then I'll come back and host the Q&A. So, Samir, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stuart. Do I need to use the microphone? Can you hear me? All right. Is this on? Is it on? Yeah? So you can hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Stuart, for the introduction. And also, I'd like to just say how delighted I am that we can work yet again with DOXA and the Van City Office for Community Engagement, as well as Stuart's folks, the Media Democracy Day and Counterculture, which also work quite closely with the Institute. So I'd like to thank in particular Kenji, Dorothy, and Selena from DOXA, and also Sandra Zink for helping to put this and many of our other events on. I'd just like to say one word, maybe two, just about this event. I think that in many ways the Institute really tries to work in the spirit of Stuart Hall, especially in the time after he left the Birmingham Centre, the University of Birmingham, and went to the Open University. And the idea there was really to literally open the university to those who didn't necessarily have the academic background, academic credentials that other institutions of higher education in Britain required. The Institute's mandate is really to open the university to the various communities in and around Vancouver. So this is something we try to do, and I think it's very much in the spirit of Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall also is very close to my work, and interest. And indeed, I've written an entry on Stuart Hall in the Encyclopedia for Postcolonial Studies, and some of what I say here will be drawing upon those reflections. So to get straight to the chase, I know we don't have a lot of time. We really want to open it up. So I'll just really touch on three things. First of all, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the film. Talk a little bit as well about how Stuart Hall's contributions are reflected or alluded to in the film, and just develop those thoughts a little bit. And then I have a few things to say about the film that I didn't quite like, or I think could have maybe been developed a little bit more by John Akomfrah. So I think this is in many ways a wonderful film, a wonderful artwork. Brings together a lovely constellation of archival footage of Stuart Hall speaking, of course, on a number of different questions, both political and biographical. And these shows that the subjective and the objective, the historical and the biographical, are closely tied together. And I think that was very well brought out by the film. It, in a way, assembles a number of fragments into this kind of configuration or constellation. And I find that very much in keeping with Stuart Hall's work, and that comes through in the content. And also, I think what's really key in the film is the idea of jazz, of Miles Davis in particular, representing the sound of this kind of history that never happened, the life that Stuart Hall never had. And you can call this a kind of counter-history. And I think this is really, really key thematically to Stuart Hall's work, because it emphasizes history as a kind of zone of particularity and contingency, as he just emphasizes towards the end of the film. And I think this is really, really key. I think Stuart Hall's work is nothing if not oriented towards rescuing a certain sense of contingency, and therefore a certain sense of possibility. And contingency and possibility are very closely linked to politics. So I think he's doing this, both against the kind of orthodox left in the immediate 56 period, Suez, Hungary, and so on. And also later on, and I think coming right out of his own experience, against a certain kind of identity politics, which wants to really sort of fix identities in particular ways and essentialize them. He's very, very keen on de-essentializing and rendering contingent those forms of identity. So the work rightfully celebrates Stuart Hall's work. That Stuart Hall's work has had such a remarkable impact comes as no surprise when one considers precisely the way in which, as the film shows, the biographical and historical closely intersect. Born in an ethnically diverse, highly respectable middle-class family in 1932, Hall became involved with the nascent anti-colonial struggles in the country of his birth, Jamaica. In 1951, he made what was to become a familiar journey for diasporic intellectuals. He traveled from the periphery to the very seat of colonial power knowledge. And it didn't come out in the film, but he went on a Rhodes Scholarship, which was really quite phenomenal, given the kind of work that he ends up doing. Which is to say, to deconstruct colonial cultural formations in such a way as to open them up and use their contradictory elements to disrupt colonial power itself. Hall's own experience is an extraordinary instance of the very politics of culture that he himself would thematize or theorize. Importantly, Hall doesn't reject European culture and ideas, but deconstructs and reconstructs elements of them in such a way as to destabilize and loosen its power. And I think this is really quite against the grain of the contemporary period. And I think this might be why he said he feels really out of time, where there's just a kind of dismissal of Europe and under the guise of Eurocentrism. So what I suggest in this encyclopedia article is that there are essentially three moments of Stuart Hall's work. Right, the first is in the immediate period of 56, in the birth of the New Left, and an attempt to really chart a middle path between the economism of the communist parties on the one hand, and also the political dogmatism on the other, to which it gives rise. So economism gives rise to certain kind of political dogmatism. So he's trying to deal with this. And the way he does so this is a second moment, really, is a reading of Gramsci and the Western Marxist tradition, the Frankfurt School, and also the French structuralism and post-structuralism. And through Gramsci, he develops this idea of repertories of resistance, so forms of culture and cultural practices that had been at best marginalized and at worst dismissed as reactionary or irrelevant by orthodox Marxism as a site or a potential site of opposition to the dominant order. And so the third, and I think perhaps most fruitful and enduring aspect of his work, was a rethinking of politics and ideology, of what he would later simply call discourse, amongst others. It wasn't just Stuart Hall who used that term. And this was the not yet fully formed coherent worldviews of particular social classes, but rather forms that comprised a wide range of signifying practices. This led to the notion that the ideological sign is multivalent or constantly in play. Ideology does not consist in a straightforward way of the ruling ideas of a given epoch, as Marx would say, but rather it's that principle that intervenes to arrest this contingent and always changing flow of signification in such a way as to temporarily fix its meaning. Right? So this is really key idea of Hall's that plays through much of his later work. And this really crystallizes in what he calls his conjunctural analyses of Thatcherism. And this was a political discourse that has had probably the most far-reaching impact on the Western world, because we really refer now to Thatcherism as neoliberalism. Right? And Hall showed how irreducible its deployment of racial, ethnic, and national elements was in generating a hegemonic project to keep it in place. Given that Thatcherism was a principal harbinger of globalization, Hall's work, and neoliberalism, as I said, Hall's work could be said to have anticipated well in advance the deeply contradictory resurgence of new forms of ethnic particularity within or vis-a-vis the increasing global penetration of capital. Right? So quite different from what Marx thought. Marx thought these particularistic identities would eventually evaporate and disappear. But what has happened, in fact, and what Hall is anticipating already in the 70s, is that there's a resurgence of these kinds of identities. Right, so these identities played a key role in the attempt to stage, and actually it was a successful attempt to stage a hegemonic response to what Hall calls through Gramsci the organic crisis of British society. Thatcherism was much more than a code word for neoliberal economics. Rather, it was what Hall called authoritarian populism, and I think we're going to be hearing a little bit about that later. A discourse that fused together or articulated free market economics and the conservative privileging of social institutions such as community, family, within an overarching framework of redoubled emphasis on law and order. Because it was more fluid and unstable than most discourses, it required particularly affective forms of signification to hold its extremely contradictory elements in place. This work was done by way of a deployment of the explosively charged vigors of race and ethnicity, as we've seen today in the film. Thatcherism, in other words, conjured the specter of the old, the particularistic identity of Englishness. It was precisely such a form of identity that worked to stabilize the new historic bloc that Thatcherism represented by sharply delimiting friend and foe, those who belonged and those who did not belong to the nation. We saw the demonization of youth cultures, for example, as playing also a key role in that. It wasn't just race and ethnicity, but it was youth as a target of this kind of discourse. So, however, in our time, it seems to me, and I think this is a contestable claim, and I imagine that people will want to contest it. Cultural studies seems today to be moving away from Hall's vision. And I'm certainly not expressing a nostalgia for Hall's idea of cultural studies, but rather I am, I suppose, expressing nostalgia somewhat for one that's grounded in material practices, or an understanding of material practices out in the world. Now, I think one of the key things why Hall was so successful as a public intellectual was that he refused to be disciplined by the academy. And this can be attributed to his stubbornly ethical adherence to the Gramscian ideal of the organic intellectual, which entails two distinct kinds of responsibility. First, it necessitates the non-dogmatic, open-ended drive to locate new avenues of theoretical and empirical research, rather than simply recognizing what was supposedly always already known. Second, it involves the impulse to disseminate such knowledge dialogically with those who are not professional intellectuals. This idea of conversation comes up over and over again, especially towards the end. I think this is key, and it'll be key to what I have to say somewhat critically about the film in a minute. Right? So only through the difficult labor of bringing both these moments into a critical tension would it be possible to construe intellectual work as part of a larger political project. Unlike many post-colonial writers whose work is directed primarily at an academic audience, Hall has disseminated his rigorous analyses in a variety of fora, such as the now defunct Marxism Today, public lectures, public policy debates at the national and international levels. Right? And we've seen so much of that in this film. It's so beautifully done. But this brings me then to the main problem I have with the film, that so much of contemporary cultural studies, if not the humanities and social sciences more generally, is less interested in understanding the kinds of social struggles that are going on all around us than, in a sense, studying itself or studying themselves. How many conferences, for example, are geared to the question of what is cultural studies? There's this ongoing discussion about what cultural studies is. And that's not something that I would see Stuart Hall particularly interested in. He wants to understand, through the lens of cultural studies, its tools and so on, what's going on in the world. And I don't want to posit too sharp a distinction between the two, but I think you know what I mean. And such inwardly directed questions are directly tied into what you could call a star system, where people will line up early in the morning for tickets to hear Zizek or Butler or Critchley or others speak, who often command truly obscene and unjustifiable speakers' fees in this time of austerity and crisis within the university. I think this is a real problem. I mean, let's be blunt. It's a real problem. So I'll come just to my conclusion now. So unfortunately, Akomfrah's film contributes, perhaps unwittingly, to the system insofar as he fails to place Hall and his work in the context of a group of committed researchers who are loosely known as the Birmingham School. In other words, he presents intellectual work, by and large, as work undertaken in a more or less solitary way, rather than in solidarity with other like-minded intellectuals, which is how I believe Hall conceived of his own work. And it's quite clear that this is how he conceived of it, through, again, this emphasis on dialogue and conversation. In a recent interview, and indeed in the publicity for the event, Akomfrah is quoted as describing Hall as a kind of rock star for us, a rock star. Right? And this is part of the system that I think is very problematic. So what gets elided are the contributions of people such as Chas Critcher, Tony Jeffries, and John N. Clark, who collaborated with Hall on a book entitled Policing the Crisis. The essential work of Dick Hebditch and Angela McRobbie, who helped us to understand the politics of subcultures and the meaning of style. And perhaps more importantly, Paul Gilroy, whose reflection on the nature of the double consciousness that Hall is talking about throughout this film in his book, The Black Atlantic, could certainly have further enriched the story that Akomfrah wants to tell. By bringing in these voices, the film might have shown the way in which Stuart Hall's work was no monologue, but arose out of a dialogue, not only with the momentous historical events of his time, but also with those who struggle to understand and intervene in them. Thank you.
Hello, does this work? Okay. So I want to say right up front that I don't do a lot of public speaking, and I'm pretty nervous right now. So if at some point I have a panic attack and pass out, It's not part of the talk. Please help me. I've told Maria, so she knows to help me if I...
It's funny, this
It's
guy, he
sprawled
ran
over.
as a candidate in the provincial elections, and he's scared of talking.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. So we want to thank the organizers for inviting us to speak at this event. We're honored to be here and to be part of this whole project. The film is very beautiful. I think it's very necessary for us to point out that, so before we talk about the work of Stuart Hall and this film that we all just saw, we want to acknowledge where we are today. We are on the unceded lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. We would also like to acknowledge that we are in a building funded by the Goldcorp Mining Corporation, which, as I'm guessing by the applause, many of you know, continuously profits from natural destruction as well as the dispossession and exploitation of Indigenous and poor people across the world. In the spirit of Stuart Hall's collaborative work at the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, we, myself and Maria, have decided to collaborate on this presentation. A lot of our work can be woven in together, so it makes sense for us to combine it here today. Plus, The Mainlander, a publication, online publication, which you should all be reading, we're both editors for, is one that generally rejects the idea of a single authorship, making most of our work basically collective.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, everyone, for inviting us. Me and Daniel, we're going to talk a little bit about Stuart Hall, and we're also going to try to link his writing on the policing the crisis to the current situation in Vancouver today. So to start with, we can say that Hall can in many ways be characterized as a theorist of the present. His focus lies in understanding the historical specificity of a particular moment, or what Hall called the conjuncture, or the history of the present. Hall has since the 50s written about a range of conjunctures, the rise of Thatcherism, the Notting Hill race riots and the articulation of race in British society, later the emergence of multiculturalism and common sense neoliberalism. These are just to name a few things. Hall is constantly challenging us to better understand the present and consider the strategies needed to intervene in the historic situations we find ourselves. From this point of view, his writing can be seen as a series of discursive interventions, or to use Lenin's metaphor, a series of attempts of bending the stick. Hall himself writes that he's always tried to kick the paradigm in a certain direction, shift the terms of the debate, intervene on one side or another, or wipe some other distorting views out of place so something else can come through. This is also precisely what he has done. In books and articles such as Marxism Without Guarantees, Notes on Marx Methods, Policing the Crisis, all of these titles are a lot longer. I don't think titles was his strong side in many ways. And more recently, the Kilburn Manifesto. These articles and books represent specific intervention into very contested terrains, all of which had lasting effects to this day.
In 1978, Stuart Hall co-authored a book that Samir mentioned in passing. The book was titled Policing the Crisis, Mugging, the State, and Law and Order. In the book, the authors wrote about a period of time in the early 1970s when suddenly mugging became an issue that was being reported in the news, being described as a crisis, and eventually becoming the justification for the police and judges to clamp down and level ever more stringent punishments. Some of the assumptions employed to justify such measures were that mugging was a new phenomenon and that it was far more widespread at that time than it had ever been. Hall and co-writers, however, pointed out that this was not the case. The numbers were exaggerated, and the phenomenon of mugging has long been around. The authors make the case that mugging should be understood in relation to the constellations of responses which followed. Mugging is not just the initial act. It's also the response of the police, the judicial system, the press, and the general public. Taking that into consideration, the authors recognize that it's important to look at what this trumped-up phenomenon of mugging ended up justifying. They argue that it gave a pretext for increased policing of low-income and racialized people and proved to be a way to quietly smuggle a state of exception where civil liberties are limited. First, those liberties of the already poor and alienated, and then ultimately those of the larger public. So here we are in a different continent, and 35 years after Policing the Crisis was written. Vancouver's sole municipal department to receive additional funding in the period 2008 to 2013 was the police. And since 2008, the police budget has increased a stunning $54 million. At the time when the housing crisis and the social crisis continues to deepen, and while the crime rate has actually continued to drop over time, the police response has nevertheless continued to escalate. So over the last few years, here in Vancouver, we have witnessed an intensified campaign to criminalize homelessness and poverty in Vancouver. Jaywalking tickets, street vending tickets, red zoning, which is basically a no-go order, and bylaws against political structures, have all amounted to different state-led attempts trying to target dissent and impoverished. For example, one fact that you might be familiar with is that 95% of all vending tickets and 76% of all jaywalking tickets in Vancouver were handed out in the downtown east side in around 5 blocks since 2008. We have neighborhood security patrols that are proliferating in our city. In areas ranging from Strathcona, downtown east side, Mount Pleasant, and Hastings Sunrise are becoming part of an increasingly larger network, surveillance network. The downtown east side is now the most surveilled area in North America. And you shouldn't quote me on that. I actually made it up. But it's probably true. The rest is true for sure. New partnerships between social workers and the police. Well, I'm on the wrong page. New partnerships are producing new insidious forms of control. The parks, streets, back alleys, and the staircases, as well as the corridors of social housing projects, are now intensively surveilled. To add to this, the mayor recently announced a mental health crisis. This was in September. Alongside the chief of the VPD, this mental health crisis was announced. In the press release, the mayor paints a terrifying picture of violent attacks in the midst of a public health crisis, on the verge of spiraling out of control. The city report resorts to graphic images and anecdotes, repeating the notion that people with severe mental illness are a threat to the public. This recalls, of course, the Policing the Crisis, which detailed the ways in which the press, as well as policymakers, reported uncritically the positions of the policy department, helping paint an exaggerated picture of hordes of muggers on the rampage. This discourse and rhetoric, stoking moral panic, has allowed for the creation of a state of exception. This has also allowed for the re-emergence of what I hope was unacceptable ideas, such as shipping off the poor to internment camps in the forest. This is a position that was recently reported in 24 Hours newspaper. The signifier of the mentally ill has become what Stuart Hall calls an ideological conductor. The term has become fixed to represent the poor, undesirable, and often racialized populations. News about the crisis are coupled with dramatized images of the downtown east side, setting in motion an ideological project, of course highly contradictory, completely disconnected from the initial concern, which was, namely, supporting people who are dealing with mental health problems. The moral panic around mugging and mental health is also echoed in popular responses to migrants arriving in Canada. In August of 2010, when 492 Sri Lankan Tamil asylum seekers reached BC's shores on the MV Sun Sea, a Thai cargo ship, they were generalized as potential terrorists and key jumpers. All 300 men, teenagers among them, were detained at the Fraser Regional Correctional Center. The women without children were held at the Alouette Correctional Center for Women. Those with children ended up at the Burnaby Youth Custody Service Center. Following this, in 2010, the Canadian government passed the Preventing Human Smugglers from Abusing Canada's Immigration System Act. Succinctly put, dramatically changing our asylum system and establishing the practice of indefinite detentions of migrants. In 2013, almost 10,000 people have been put in administrative detention while the state considers their case. The average length of their stay is 25 days, but some are detained for years. As of November 8 of 2013, 585 people who had unsuccessfully applied for refugee status or who did not have documentation were being held in Canadian immigration cells. 60 of them had been languishing for more than a year in a country that is one of the few Western states to impose indefinite detentions on migrants. Recently, Lucia Jimenez committed suicide when the CBSA set out to deport her. Following the analysis in Hall's Policing the Crisis, there is an effort to depict migrants as taking advantage of Canada, justifying their criminalization, justifying the new laws on the asylum system, and even playing a role in feeding them into the temporary foreign worker stream rather than the immigration process. In Canada today, we have to see migration as not just the initial act, but the process of using the specter of an influx of migrants to frighten the citizenry into accepting increasingly authoritarian measures. Stuart Hall has talked about how such authoritarian measures can be seen as a response, systemic rather than conscious and deliberate, to threats to the neoliberal agenda. Perhaps we can see Vancouver's increasing reliance on policing in the same way. It's not a coincidence, for instance, that one effective way of facilitating the process of creeping gentrification into low-income parts of the city is to siphon people off into mental health institutions and prisons. The VPD's practice of red zoning, in particular, is a blatant attempt to control who is allowed where in the neoliberal city.
So this mode of policing in Stuart Hall times, as in our own, is highly racialized. Ticketing, surveillance, and detention of migrants are part of a continuum of punitive measures that particularly target communities of color. The racial effects are also evident in the federal penitentiary systems. We have in the past 5 years, the population of Indigenous inmates have gone up 43%. In BC, Indigenous people represent about 5% of the population, but nearly a quarter of the admissions of the province correctional centres. Clearly, this is an articulation of race, or racism in capitalist society, which is something that Hall wrought throughout his career. Intensified policing, anchored in a narrative of crisis, mental health, and safety, has been rolled out in the name of ending homelessness, solving the mental health crisis, and saving Canada from potential terrorists and key jumpers. The means have started justifying the ends. In Common Sense Neoliberalism, Hall writes about this. He writes, in fact, what they're really doing is not just invoking popular opinion, but shaping and influencing it so they can harness it in their favor. By asserting that popular opinion already agrees, I mean, we all want to end homelessness and we all want to end the mental health crisis, they hope to produce agreement as an effect. In this respect, the policing of the crisis has become what Hall calls a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the state sets out to solve the problem that is created and it is framed. So as a few concluding words on Hall, we'd like to talk about him as an academic as well. And I think in many ways it's impossible to think about Hall without considering his academic and public role. Hall was very much a public figure, as we already talked about, and ever present in public politics and debate from the 50s onwards. He was one of the founders of the New Left Review, lectured at the Open University London, and constantly appeared in the press and on the television. He was a truly public intellectual, informed by a deep commitment to the inseparability of intellectual and political life. Unfortunately, academics that intervene directly into the public debate, not shying away from taking public position, are in short supply today. A true public intellectual, or perhaps what Gramsci and Hall himself would call an organic intellectual, is one whose scholarly analysis and insights inspire them to step into the public sphere, working in solidarity with efforts to organize people directly affected by racism, colonialism, capitalism, and authoritarianism.
Hall's role as a public intellectual should also be seen in the light of this theoretical work and his return to the theoretical debate around the relation between culture, ideology, and economy. His focus was, of course, always on culture and ideology, but without ever losing sight of the material basis of the two. In the recently published Neoliberal Common Sense, Hall concludes that labor must build an alternative consensus on alternative philosophy. Yet simultaneously, the left must also return to the question of practice, pose the organizational question, rethink the dialectic of party and movement, and build a social base. The relationship between ideas and base building is dialectical, and Hall would certainly agree. But it's also a debate about where the emphasis resides within the dialectic. And I think on that note, I think it would be fitting to end with a quote from Stuart Hall, which might serve to wrap everything up. The way is not to go back, the way is to go forward. That requires a lot of hard thought, not sentimentality. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone. I've just been told we've got about 15 minutes and then we need to clear out because they're shutting down. But I just before we start, I want to thank our panelists and my friend Samir, but Maria and Daniel, not only were your comments astute and sharp, but the way you did it couldn't have been more beautifully as an echo of Hall. So thank you for that. I think we can open the floor. Questions and comments. Can I ask this? May I ask you to keep your question to a minute at a maximum? Please wait for the mic. People will run to you. Would anybody? Yes.
Does anybody know what that last line was?
The last line, yeah, it's Stuart Hall saying any comments on what the future will beget. And what?
He said I'm a cynic by nature, but I'm an optimist by will.
By will.
Yes, I think it's a quote.
It's a Gramscian quote. It's totally. Did you hear that?
No.
He said he drew on a quote from Gramsci, one that he's associated with, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Yes. It's right here.
There's one right there.
Donya.
Hi. I have a quick comment and maybe a question. I welcome the panelists' answer if you have anything to say about that. In some ways, Samir mentioned cultural studies and some things lacking in terms of dialogue with big names in cultural studies. In some ways, the film itself, aesthetically and structurally, is a cultural studies kind of film. It shows it resorts to montage and collage. It doesn't give us a predeterministic audience. It's speaking across multiple genres, right? It has the framing device of the jazz and weaves in and out of the archive and tells a personal. It's almost like the autobiography of Stuart Hall told by the filmmaker. Like the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas written by Gertrude Stein in that kind of way. So, in fact, that cultural studies look to the film in a way tells us what the difference between European cultural studies and the kind of self-examining, self-referential cultural studies in North America that continues to ask a question: what are we and what do we do? So if you could say anything about that would be great.
Samir, do you?
Yeah, well, thank you for the comment, Donia. I mean, I agree. I suppose the film represents both the best and the worst of cultural studies, insofar as it really does draw all those elements together very beautifully. And in fact, what I meant to say, and what I noticed in this most recent viewing, is that it's quite funny. I mean, the close-ups of the mouths consuming the food and then trying to lose the weight. I mean, that was quite funny, but it's also quite kitsch too, isn't it? Right? I wasn't prepared with what I was going to meet with when I arrived in Britain, and then the storms are breaking on the shore. I was like, oh yeah, symbolism, beautiful, right? So that was meant to be, I think, kind of funny as well. It's that sort of kitsch moment, and the undoing of this opposition between the high and the low, right, against this background of Miles Davis and so on. But I really was quite bothered, and I think what you guys did was beautiful, right, in terms of this collaboration, which was missing, right? It's all about this one intellectual's self-reflection as told through Akomfrah, right? I think if Stuart Hall were to do it himself, it would be much more open and collaborative. I'd like to think that. And he really operated in that way. And I think that's an indication of maybe a wrong turn of cultural studies. Because if you're so turned in on yourself and within the academy, how can you really open yourself up to social struggles and social movements? I don't see it happening. I really don't. But thank you.
Are there other questions?
Oh, I saw you were first.
Here.
This is really just a question that. Sorry. Did I jump?
No, yours.
Oh, okay. Actually, it's really just a reiteration of a question that was already kind of mentioned or alluded to by Stuart. Why was there, and I would agree with your initial conception, why, in your opinion, did the filmmaker somewhat underplay Hall's connections, not just to questions of race and eventually gender, but class? And also the fact that, you could go through that entire film and not know that at the very least Hall emerged from Marxism, right? Like emerged from class struggles, and it was just weird to me that you could actually get through that entire film and you wouldn't know. You would have no idea that was the case, right? Yeah.
I have nothing really to add to that. I'd say I agree.
I think it is. Can I just add? I think it's an interesting parallel with the observation Samir has offered, which is that the moment of Hall's immense engagement with Marx was also the moment of his deeply dialogic forms of writing, collaborative writing, etc., and rethinking the whole practice of the academy, right? In both at the center and then at Open University, and those elements of his work kind of pale next to the star system that operates now, and that the film is really designed with that in mind, I think, or in homage to, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, good. I mean, thank you, Stuart, for that, and also the question. I mean, just on Facebook today, I saw a posting of an early essay by Stuart Hall interpreting the introduction to the Grundrisse, right? Exactly, your point. Let's maybe give a more generous reading now. I mean, I'm being quite critical of the film. Give a generous reading, and that is that when you talk about the New Left in particular contexts, you are suggesting a whole set of things, right? The kinds of things I think that I was trying to make explicit. A movement away from economism, the dogmatism of top-down party organizational structures. So class is in a sense implied in that, right? So maybe he doesn't, especially in the British context, feel the need to make that explicit. But there's also, the miners' strike and the social struggles that are happening in the mid-'80s that signify class. So they're not made explicit, but they're there. They're visually present. So I guess you have to read them. Maybe that's a more generous reading. But I like where you're going with what Stuart had to say.
Yes.
I just kind of had a comment. I suspect I'm probably the only Jamaican in the room, and that's okay. One is in regards to the structure of the film, certainly, and the pointing towards feminism, which, I mean, he doesn't get to control the editing, but I'd just like to raise a few names. I had the pleasure of seeing Angie McRobbie at Goldsmiths this summer in London, and is still doing amazing open work. But in terms of like black women who did amazing work at that time, Claudia Jones from Trinidad, who is buried left of Marx. So just to kind of name people within that time frame that did amazing work in creating cultural productions such as Carnival in Notting Hill as a response to that sort of stuff, as well as Audrey Huntley, who just died last year, who is from Guyana. Claudia was from Trinidad. Audrey Huntley was from Guyana, and created Toussaint Louverture Press that published Walter Rodney, who's just, was active in London at the time and absolutely brilliant. So I'd like to at least put Stuart Hall in conversation in this room, at least, so the film, due to editing or whatever choices Akoma's made, remove that. And finally, to say I had the pleasure of seeing him at a decolonization conference in Jamaica, where he was so kind as to just sit in the room and say to all these graduate students at the University of the West Indies, I started out just like you, just like you. I had no idea where I was going, but I began just like you. And he brought himself to the room and made himself available to everyone, every young person in the room that's struggling with what does academia bring to me. And so I just wanted to make those comments to the film. Thank you.
Those are very beautiful comments. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Indeed. For those. Thank you. That's fun. How about if we take one last question? Do we have? Yep.
I don't have a comment, and I have a real question. Thanking the teamwork that you did and the comment that you mentioned, the sentimentality is not enough and hard work is necessary. And once I was listening to Zizek, and he was saying that the reason that I don't go to the socialist movement, I don't attend, he said, because I don't think that they have any other solution than Keynesian economics. So my question for you is that who is doing that hard work?
Is that who's doing that hard work of coming up to an alternative to neoliberalism and Keynesianism?
Can you please read your the note that you had? Yeah, and it ends with that we need a hard work. Who is doing that?
He's speaking of the way is not to go back, the way is to go forward. That requires a lot of hard work, not sentimentality. Mm-hmm. So you're asking who's doing the hard work, right? And who's not just...
like hard work is like writing a capital. That's a hard work.
Right.
Listing all of the problems that in Vancouver we have, in everywhere else we have, is sentimentality.
Yeah.
Which is nice, is necessary too.
The quote is actually a lot of hard thought, not hard work. But yeah, maybe.
Did I say work the first time too?
Yes, I agree. Writing capital is also
writing capital is hard work and hard thought.
It's a hard thought. Yes, sure. Who is doing that hard thought instead of sentimentality and listing the problems?
Yeah. Who is doing the hard work?
Not me.
I was supposed to say hard thought, but to answer your question, who's doing the hard work?
I think there's a lot of people in this province who are doing the hard work. There's a lot of women struggling, indigenous communities of color are struggling against racism, and working class people. It's happening everywhere. I think there's a tendency, and there has been a tendency within the academy to talk about waiting for this like historical moment to emerge. But I think we're like in it, and I think people are struggling every day. So doing a lot of hard thought and hard work. So. But I think the academy has been isolated and separated for that, for a long time, and they are today. And I think that's one of the challenges to be in the academy today. And I think that's something that has to be overcome.
One last moment. Samir wanted to offer some words just as by way of wrap up. Samir?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I just wanted to say that if people are interested in knowing more about our events, at the Institute we've got some sheets outside on the table for your perusal. You can take them away with you. You can check us out on our website and Facebook page and so on and so forth. But what I really wanted to say is that we are very excited to be able to offer another set of discussions sometime, I think, in April, co-hosted with the Mainlander, that will, in a sense, extend and deepen the kinds of analyses that you've heard from Daniel and Maria and from Nate and other colleagues in this collaborative way. So we're very excited about that. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for coming out, and we'll see you at the next event.